Michael, we've had a lot of very interesting, important people on the show the past. How long have we been on? A year and a bit. And one we've been trying to get for a long time and haven't. We're going to interview now for 2 segments. Just before we do, I want to say that it's quite something. When my 22-year-old apolitical daughter says, "You've got her on the show, can you get us to sign a book for me?" And I say, "No, she's in Boston." And my daughter goes, "Oh," then you know this woman really matters. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is I think a noted scholar and author, very courageous feminist, someone who believes in freedom, who can say so much that is important, significant and authentic about Islam and the pluralism of the contemporary West. She joins us now from Boston. Welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on.
All right, it is a real pleasure. Let me ask you first, are things getting any better in the Islamic world? Because it seems to me that both in the Islamic heartland and, if you like, the Islamic diaspora, the various groups of Muslims throughout Europe and North America, if anything, the situation, the fundamentalist challenge has got worse and not better.
I think on the short term, things are getting worse because the forces of political Islam are ascending. There are more and more Muslims who feel that they can trust and vote for the candidates of political Islam. It's not only in Egypt, but it is the wider Middle East. It even goes as far as Turkey, Indonesia, Malaysia. So on the short term, things will get worse. But I think on the longer term, when people have lived under governments and they have been exposed to Sharia law, I think a lot of people will behave like the Iranian population and will start to reject Sharia as a system of law and government.
But that's both optimistic and pessimistic. Yes, in the long run it might be okay, but it could take a very long time.
It could take a very long time. It depends on the country. If you look at Iran, in 1979, they voted for Ayatollah Khomeini and a system of Sharia. In 2009, masses, large swathes of the Iranian population were objecting to that system of law. It took them about 30 years, and they are not there yet. So it could take as long as 3 decades in some countries. It could take a shorter time in other places. So I am optimistic on the longer term because humans learn from experience. And unfortunately, there is a majority of people in the Muslim world who want to try out Sharia as a system of government.
Is it the majority? Because we're given various figures, and lots of people, I think, are in denial. But would you say the majority of the world's Muslims do want to try out a system of Sharia law governance?
Well, I remember in 2002, 2003, being engaged in debates where everybody was saying, "Oh, come on, the Islamists, they're just a fringe," and so on and so forth. And then we saw 11 years later, the Arab Spring countries, or the so-called Arab Spring countries, where elections were held and free and fair elections were won by Islamists. And the Muslims who want to separate religion from state, they are there, and they're there in large numbers, but they're disorganized, they're fragmented, they have no glue to keep them together, so they need to get their act together. And I think what will help is for the people who voted for Sharia law to actually experience what that is.
Now, I think this is an important aspect of this because some will argue, well, if you've lived under a secular dictatorship, then you'll try anything to escape. That I can sort of understand. But what about in Europe, for example? Now, obviously, because of your time in Holland, you know that country particularly well. I spent 26 years living in Britain. In Britain, with its health service and pluralism, democracy, rule of law, it's a very civilized country. Pakistani and Bangladeshi Muslims who were quite secular when they came to the country, the last generation, 40, 50 years ago, their grandchildren have become radicalized. There's more support now, it seems, in countries like Britain for Sharia law and radical Islamist parties than there was in the past. And they have never lived under difficult conditions. How do we explain that?
I think we can explain it as an outcome of the continuous campaigning that was done by Islamists in Britain and other parts of Europe, where they find immigrants in self-segregated ghettos. And they hear this message day in, day out. It is about life after death. It's about their identity. It's about rejecting and hating the host countries and their values. And this goes on, and I think the host countries sort of respected that through their multiculturalist, relativist attitudes. And I think that's all these explanations combined makes up for young people who have bought into the utopia that they want a system of government that's going to take them instantly to paradise after they die. So it's an investment basically in death.
Yes, yes. But when people oppose it, I'm not talking about the far right, who I think are largely irrelevant, but when people of goodwill who believe in pluralism argue that fundamentalism is a major threat, and it does exist, you know what happens? That they're accused of being racist and Islamophobic and the like. This happens in Canada. It happens even more so in Europe.
It does. And what we are seeing is an increasing number of people who are born into Islam, who are in Canada and in Britain and in the US, who are organizing to say, this fundamentalism is bad, Sharia law is bad, that's why we left our countries. Look at the places where these experiments have been tried out. And even they get then stigmatized by the Islamists as, you know, infidels and apostates. And they are dismissed by majority countries, by the host countries, as minorities, you know, insignificant. They can't get the vote through me or Ibn Warak or Irshad Manji. So yes. We've kind of become lone voices, but I think things are changing.
Yes. Just before we go to the break, I want to ask you about your personal situation. I mean, you're never completely safe, I understand that, but could you travel to a majority Muslim country? Would you feel your security was threatened?
Well, I don't talk about security
right.
to the press, but the answer to the question, would I travel to a Muslim majority country, the answer is no.
Yeah.
I don't think that that would be practical. No, I don't think that you know, the majority of Muslims are violent, but I do think that it is not. It would be beyond common sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I understand. Okay, stay with us, please. We're going to have one more segment. I want to talk about the nature of Islam and whether it is Islam itself or a perversion of Islam that has led to these problems, which I think is a central question. Stay with us, please. Another segment with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And by the way, I'm not suggesting these books are completely appropriate for Christmas reading. However, Infidel and Nomad in particular, the two that I've read and learned so much from, I do recommend those. And if you want a good laugh as well, do have a look on YouTube of Ayaan being interviewed by Avi Lewis. You almost feel sorry for the pompous little Avi Lewis after a while because he's just ripped apart by someone who actually knows what she's talking about. Ayaan, welcome back. You're joining us from Boston, of course. If I could ask, and I think that this question is at the center of the issue, there are those who will argue that the excesses that we see from Islam these days, the intolerance, the stoning, the mutilation and so on, these are a perversion of the religion. But others will claim, no, this is Islam itself. How would you respond to that?
I would respond to that by saying Islam has a religious or spiritual dimension. It's called ibadat. It's all about prayer and other forms of worship, and that is perfectly compatible with democracy. I find it harmless, probably enriching to those who uphold those beliefs. But Islam also has a political dimension, and that ultimately ends in a desire to establish Sharia law or Islamic law. And that is very dangerous. It is intolerant. It's intolerance towards women, towards homosexuals, towards other non-Muslims in general called infidels, but in particular to Christians and Jews. Yes.
Now, I mentioned and I don't want to dwell on that because it's not really worth the time, but the interview with Avi Lewis. But time and time again, we have people who will say, well, yes, extremism is the problem here, and there's all sorts of religious extremism. Now, I think we would all agree that at certain times in the history of Christianity, for example, there have been some terrible incidents in its name. But Christianity, at its very epicenter, does preach peace. That's not always observed. And Christian extremists today are such a small number, and they live in Christian countries where the rule of law will make sure they're arrested, incarcerated. It's surely a very different challenge and issue from that of Islam.
It is, because, again, it is very clear now, after the Arab Spring, in the countries where elections were held, that a majority of voters went for political Islam. That is what we used to call extremism. Now we don't call it extreme anymore. people are trying to look for ways of adapting what they believe to the reality. I talk to commentators who think that, okay, the Muslim Brotherhood have won elections in Egypt and Tunisia, but within the Muslim Brotherhood, there are the moderates, and so on and on they go, modifying and qualifying. But ultimately, Sharia law is what it is. And I invite everyone to take a look at the places on the planet that have implemented Sharia law.
Mm-hmm. How do you deal on a personal level with those people who don't really understand the situation, but at the same time are terrified of admitting that there could be an absolute problem here? And I've seen you interviewed by some of these people, and they're terrified of admitting Islamic fundamentalism, Sharia law is a challenge to our values. And you sit there and you try to reason with them, but it must be very frustrating.
Well, I meet different kinds of people. There are people who are sincere about wanting what they have, the liberal freedoms we take for granted in the United States and in Canada for fellow Muslims all over the world. Yeah. And I urge them then to support the secular forces within those communities here and within in the countries where these values are being challenged, to go with the people who are Muslim but who are sincere about the separation of church and state or religion and state, individual rights and tolerance. And that is the way. Instead of just apologizing for the Islamists, it's better to put our energy and resources and action into helping those who are, again, sincere about freedom and tolerance.
Yeah. Within, I'm not talking about Islamic society, but within the white post-Christian liberal mindset, it's so difficult to find people who actually will admit that there is a problem, and they will turn into all sorts of shapes to justify what is going on, even when debating with someone like yourself.
Yes, some people will not admit it because I think it is very difficult for them to admit or give up something that they have believed for a long time, namely that radical Islam or political Islam is compatible with liberalism all the way. But I see increasingly that people in academia, in the press, in politics, they are waking up to the empirics, you know, all the evidence that is showing that political Islam is not compatible with all the freedoms that we take for granted. And that is the mindset that needs to continue changing. And then they shouldn't feel so helpless or guilty about what the white man did in the 20th century and in the 19th century, but focus on the way we live together in a world that is getting ever smaller. And when ideas, totalitarian ideas, take shape, whether they're justified in the name of religion or not, we need to recognize that reality and, you know, not sit around and wait for things to be taken over by them.
Right. Well, I'm glad you said that, because I have to admit my limited experience, nothing compared to yours, but it's been a little different. I'll see marches really backing the Iranian regime, and there'll be gay groups or Jewish groups, some Jewish groups, supporting them. And you think, what are you, suicidal? Feminist groups, for example, the very people who will be the first victims of a Sharia revolution seem to be those backing the people who will put them into concentration camps, for goodness sake.
Yes, and it's really a sad state of affairs, and all I can do is either show simply through, again, the abundant evidence that is now out there, and from personal experience. At the age of 15, 16, I became a member of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, and at that point, even in Nairobi, fellow Muslims thought of the movement itself as eccentric, as something odd. And now, look how strong a movement it has become. So it's just a matter of really telling and retelling and showing the evidence and doing it as peacefully as we can. Yeah,
well, you do a fine job of that, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Really, I do mean this. Your work and your books and also your courage, I think, have been an inspiration to many, many people. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on, and good luck.